I, as zealous as herself, hurried eagerly home to admire on my part, though I was very sad for Hindley's sake. He had room in his heart only for two idols, his wife and himself. He doted on both and adored one, and I couldn't conceive how he could bear the loss. When we got to Wuthering Heights, there he stood at the front door, and as I passed in, I asked, "How was the baby?" "Nearly ready to run around now," he replied, putting on a cheerful smile. "And the mistress?" I ventured to inquire. "The doctor says she's—" "Damn the doctor," he interrupted reddeningly. "Frances is quite right. She'll be perfectly well by this time next week. Are you going upstairs? Will you tell her that I'll come, if she'll promise not to talk? I left her because she would not hold her tongue, and she must. Tell her Mr. Kenneth says she must be quiet." I delivered this message to Mrs. Earnshaw. She seemed in flighty spirits and replied merrily, "I hardly spoke a word, Ellen, and there he has gone out twice crying. Well, say I promise I won't speak, but that does not bind me not to laugh at him. Poor soul! Till within a week of her death that gay heart never failed her, and her husband persisted doggedly, nay furiously, in affirming her health improved every day. When Kenneth warned him that his medicines were useless at that stage of the malady, and he needn't put him to further expense by attending her, he retorted, "I know you need not. She's well. She does not want any more attendance from you. She never was in a consumption. It was a fever, and it is gone. Her pulse is as slow as mine now, and her cheek as cool." He told his wife the same story, and she seemed to believe him. But one night, while leaning on his shoulder, in the act of saying she thought she should be able to get up tomorrow, a fit of coughing took her, a very slight one. He raised her in his arms. She put her two hands about his neck. Her face changed, and she was dead. As the girl had anticipated, the child Hareton fell wholly into my hands. Mr. Earnshaw, provided he saw him healthy and never heard him cry, was contented as far as regarded him. For himself he grew desperate. His sorrow was of that kind that will not lament. He neither wept nor prayed. He cursed and defied, execrated God and man, and gave himself up to reckless dissipation. The servants could not bear his tyrannical and evil conduct long. Joseph and I were the only two that would stay. I had not the heart to leave my charge, and besides, you know, I had been his foster sister and excused his behavior more readily than a stranger would. Joseph remained to act over tenants and laborers, and because it was his vocation to beware, he had plenty of wickedness to reprove. The master's bad ways and bad companions formed a pretty example for Catherine and Heathcliff. His treatment of the latter was enough to make a fiend of a saint, and truly it appeared as if the lad were possessed of something diabolical at that period. He delighted to witness Hindley degrading himself past redemption, and became daily more notable for savage sullenness and ferocity. I could not half tell what an infernal house we had. The curate dropped calling, and nobody decent came near us at last, unless Edgar Linton's visits to Miss Cathy might be an exception. At 15, she was the queen of the countryside. She had no peer, and she did turn out a haughty, headstrong creature. I own I did not like her after her infancy was past, and I vexed her frequently by trying to bring down her arrogance. She never took an aversion to me, though. She had a wondrous constancy to old attachments. Even Heathcliff kept his hold on her affections unalterably, and young Linton, with all his superiority, found it difficult to make an equally deep impression. He was my late master. That is his portrait over the fireplace. It used to hang on one side, and his wife's on the other, but hers has been removed, or else you might see something of what she was. Can you make that out? Mrs. Dean raised the candle, and I discerned a soft-featured face exceedingly resembling the young lady at the Heights, but more pensive and amiable in expression. It formed a sweet picture. The long light hair curled slightly on the temples. The eyes were large and serious, the figure almost too graceful. I did not marvel how Catherine Earnshaw could forget her first friend for such an individual. I marveled much how he, with a mind to correspond with his person, could fancy my idea of Catherine Earnshaw. A very agreeable portrait, I observed to the housekeeper. Is it like? Yes, she answered, but he looked better when he was animated. That is his everyday countenance. He wanted spirit in general. Catherine had kept up her acquaintance with the Lintons since her 5 weeks' residence among them, and as she had no temptation to show her rough side in their company, and had the sense to be ashamed of being rude where she experienced such invariable courtesy, she imposed unwittingly on the old lady and gentleman by her ingenious cordiality, gained the admiration of Isabella and the heart and soul of her brother, acquisitions that flattered her from the first, for she was full of ambition, and led her to adopt a double character without exactly intending to deceive anyone. In the place where she heard Heathcliff termed a vulgar young ruffian and a worse than a brute, she took care not to act like him. But at home she had small inclination to practice politeness that would only be laughed at, and restrain an unruly nature when it would bring her neither credit nor praise. Mr. Edgar seldom mustered courage to visit Wuthering Heights openly. He had a terror of Earnshaw's reputation, and shrunk from encountering him, and yet he was always received with our best attempts at civility. The master himself avoided offending him, knowing why he came, and if he could not be gracious, kept out of the way. I rather think his appearance there was distasteful to Catherine. She was not artful, never played the coquette, and had evidently an objection to her two friends meeting at all. For when Heathcliff expressed contempt of Linton in his presence, she could not half coincide as she did in his absence, and when Linton evinced disgust and antipathy to Heathcliff, she dared not retreat his sentiments with indifference, as if depreciation of her playmate were of scarcely any consequence to her. I've had many a laugh at her perplexities and untold troubles, which she vainly strove to hide from my mockery. That sounds ill-natured, but she was so proud it became really impossible to pity her distresses, till she should be chastened into more humility. She did bring herself finally to confess and to confide in me. There was not a soul else that she might fashion into an adviser. Mr. Hindley had gone from home one afternoon, and Heathcliff presumed to give himself a holiday on the strength of it. He had reached the age of 16 then, I think, and without having bad features or being deficient in intellect, he contrived to convey an impression of inward and outward repulsiveness that his present aspect retains no traces of. In the first place, he had by that time lost the benefit of his early education. Continual hard work, begun soon and concluded late, had extinguished any curiosity he once possessed in pursuit of knowledge, and any love for books of learning. His childhood's sense of superiority, instilled into him by the favors of old Mr. Earnshaw, was faded away. He struggled long to keep up an equality with Catherine in her studies, and yielded with poignant though silent regret, but he yielded completely, and there was no prevailing on him to take a step in the way of moving upward when he found he must necessarily sink beneath his former level. Then personal appearance sympathized with mental deterioration. He acquired a slouching gait and an ignoble look. His naturally reserved disposition was exaggerated into an almost idiotic excess of unsociable moroseness, and he took a grim pleasure, apparently, in exciting the aversion rather than the esteem of his few acquaintance. Catherine and he were constant companions still at his seasons of respite from labor, but he had ceased to express his fondness for her in words, and recoiled with angry suspicion from her girlish caresses, as if conscious There could be no gratification in lavishing such marks of affection on him. On the before-named occasion, he came into the house to announce his intention of doing nothing, while I was assisting Miss Cathy to arrange her dress. She had not reckoned on his taking it into his head to be idle, and, imagining she would have the whole place to herself, she managed, by some means, to inform Mr. Edgar of her brother's absence, and was then preparing to receive him. "Cathy, are you busy this afternoon?" asked Heathcliff. "Are you going anywhere?" "No, it is raining," she answered. "Why have you that silk frock on, then?" he said. "Nobody's coming here, I hope." "Not that I know of," stammered Miss. "But you should be in the field now, Heathcliff. It is an hour past dinner time. I thought you were gone." "Hindley does not often free us from his accursed presence," observed the boy. "I'll not work any more today. I'll stay with you." "Oh, but Joseph will tell," she suggested. "You'd better go." "Joseph is loading lime on the further side of Penistone Crag. It will take him till dark, and he'll never know." So saying, he lounged to the fire and sat down. Catherine reflected an instant with knitted brows. She found it needful to smooth the way for an intrusion. "Isabella and Edgar Linton talked of calling this afternoon," she said, at the conclusion of a minute silence. "As it rains, I hardly expect them, but they may come, and if they do, you run the risk of being scolded for no good." "Order Ellen to say you are engaged, Cathy," he persisted. "Don't turn me out for those pitiful, silly friends of yours. I'm on the point sometimes of complaining but I'll not." "That they what?" cried Catherine, gazing at him with a troubled countenance. "Oh, Nellie," she added petulantly, jerking her head away from my hands, "you've combed my hair quite out of curl. That's enough. Let me alone." "What are you on the point of complaining about, Heathcliff?" "Nothing. Only look at the almanac on the wall." He pointed to a framed sheet hanging near the window, and continued, "The crosses are for the evenings you have spent with the Lintons. The dots are for those spent with me. Do you see? I've marked every day." "Yes, very foolish, as if I took notice," replied Catherine in a peevish tone. "And where is the sense of that?" "To show that I do take notice," said Heathcliff. "And should I always be sitting with you?" she demanded, growing more irritated. "What good do I get? What do you talk about? You might be dumb or a baby for anything you say to amuse me, or for anything you do either." "You never told me before that I talked too little, or that you disliked my company, Cathy," exclaimed Heathcliff in much agitation. "It's no company at all, when people know nothing and say nothing," she muttered. Her companion rose up, but he hadn't time to express his feelings further, for a horse's feet were heard on the flags, and having knocked gently, young Linton entered, his face brilliant with delight at the unexpected summons he had received. Doubtless Cathy remarked the differences between her friends as one came in and the other went out. The contrast resembled what you see in exchanging a bleak, hilly, cold country for a beautiful, fertile valley. And his voice and greeting were as opposite as his aspect. He had a sweet, low manner of speaking, and pronounced his words as you do. That's less gruff than we talk here, and softer. "I'm not come too soon, am I?" he said, casting a look at me. I had begun to wipe the plate and tidy some drawers at the far end in the dresser. "No," answered Catherine. "What are you doing there, Nellie?" "My work, miss," I replied. Mr. Hindley had given me directions to make a third party in any private visits Linton chose to pay. She stepped behind me and whispered crossly, "Take yourself and your dusters off when company are in the house. Servants don't commence scouring and cleaning in the room where they are."